Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Peter Michael Bauer, and I am here to talk to y'all about rewilding. So I'm just going to go ahead and give myself a little intro here. Please feel free to comment on here as much as you'd like and ask me questions. I really enjoy being asked questions as I'm talking. Helps me kind of work with the flow a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about myself as we get started here. Uh, my name is Peter Michael Bauer. I'm from Portland, Oregon, and I got into rewilding as a teenager, although I didn't have the word back then. Um, the way that we just described it was basically like a survivalist. I didn't quite understand the full breadth of what rewilding meant and um, how indigenous people and hunter gatherers around the world actually lived. And so I thought it was more about just like learning wilderness survival and survival skills. So when I was 16, I read this book called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And that book brought to my awareness all of the things around civilization, its origin, its potential and probable collapse. And at that point, I was kind of like, what is a good as a high school diploma going to be if civilization collapses? I need to actually learn skills, like real things that will help me survive the apocalypse or whatever, survive the collapse of civilization. Um, and so I dropped out of high school, ran away from home to go to a wilderness skills school in New Jersey on the other side of this country. And then I just came back home, started learning lots of skills from all kinds of different people, and just started voraciously reading anthropology and eventually started connecting with the indigenous people of this place and learned Chinnaquawa, which is the native trade language of the Northwest here. And At that point, in the early aughts, I got into green anarchy. And it was through green anarchy that I came across the word rewilding in 2004. They published a magazine, Green Anarchy magazine, and I think it was issue number 3 was called Rewilding, and it described essentially what I had been doing already for, probably nearly 8 to 10 years at that point. And so it was a really kind of aha moment to have some vocabulary and a word that actually really described well what it was that I was doing. And so I decided in 2006 to create a website, rewild.com, that would serve as a international forum for the discussions around rewilding. At that point in time, I didn't know that there was this other avenue of rewilding that was the conservation rewilding. There wasn't really any literature. I think there was maybe one book, Rewilding North America, at that point by Dave Foreman, I believe. Um, I was more coming at rewilding from the human rewilding side, not conservation biology. So um, I ended up creating this website to talk about human rewilding, which emerged from anarcho primitivism or green anarchy, the idea that the only living, the longest living and most ancient form of anarchy is actually hunter gatherers who live without a state and with minimal to no hierarchy. And with the majority or immediate return hunter gatherers, there's some distinction between different hunter gatherer groups that's really important to understand. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Um, but yeah, the difference between conservation rewilding and human rewilding, or what I call holistic rewilding, which actually incorporates humans into ecosystems, comes from that tradition of anarcho primitivism, which is now generally called primal anarchy, which recognizes that humans evolved for 3 million years in stateless societies, and the invention of states is very recent and is part of this larger system of civilization that is destroying the planet and causing the sixth mass extinction. Um, so through that website, I ended up kind of embracing that word and then realizing that I needed to create a movement around it that was larger than the subculture of anarcho primitivism or green anarchy. And so the website rewild.com was one of the ways that I started to do that, just by bringing in different people all around the world to discuss the concepts. And at that time, blogging was still super popular. It was before there were like, everybody was chatting on Facebook and things like that. So we ended up just linking all these different people from all over the world that were blogging about rewilding. And then that was something that I started doing as well, was writing these essays about rewilding, mostly because I realized after trying to do survival skills how hard it was to do anything by yourself. The challenges I had in finding somebody like an elder or a mentor in all of the different aspects of living in a place, and the challenges therein. And so I realized that in order to actually rewild in the way that I needed to and wanted to, it was going to take a lot more people. And in order to do that, I was going to need to start writing and persuading people in order to follow the rewilding lifestyle or life way, or whatever you want to call it. And that's when I started writing these essays about rewilding on my blog, which eventually turned into a book called Rewild or Die. Um, and so Rewild or Die was a collection of those essays to persuade people to pick up rewilding, and to understand fundamentally what is wrong with society and what has been causing the sixth mass extinction for the last 10,000 years. And in hopes that we could actually learn from the past and how humans lived sustainably or regeneratively for as long as we have. Um, and so eventually I realized that all of my efforts had been on the internet, and there wasn't really a local group of people that I was drawing from. And that's when I switched gears, kind of moved away from online and created Rewild Portland. Rewild Portland's a nonprofit. Our mission is to promote cultural and environmental resilience through the education of earth-based arts, traditions, and technologies. So we do a lot of community building through ancestral skills and through wild foods and things like that. We're shifting gears a lot now to basically be more about um, local subsistence and regenerative subsistence strategies based on the indigenous practices of this place, also known as traditional ecological knowledge. That to me is sort of the bridge of conservation rewilding, like the intent behind conservation rewilding and the intent behind human rewilding. I think the main problem with conservation rewilding is that it perceives wildness as the space that is non-human, and so we abandon spaces and let them rewild. But the reality is that humans, as hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists, can be inspiration to the landscape and actually bring back biodiversity intentionally through our practices of disturbance. There can be regenerative disturbance. And I think that's a huge missing component in conservation rewilding. And so I think the intent is there to protect lands, but the knowledge and understanding of humans and how we can integrate into those lands is absent in that framework. And so my sort of goal with most of the rewilding I do is to merge the human rewilding, which kind of came from the sort of survivalist, anarchist perspective, and the conservation rewilding, which doesn't really see people as part of the landscape, and merge those two things together through traditional ecological knowledge, which is something that indigenous people all over the world have been practicing everywhere where they exist. And so it's an important thing to kind of understand like all of these different factors of like how humans behave in different ways and where we went wrong, or whatever, however you want to perceive that. So, for me, I like to go, I like to look at the etymology of the word wild. And there's a certain potency to that word. It has both romanticized and demonized qualities. If you think about the term like wild and crazy, you can see the demonization of wildness happening there. But then if you look at the phrase wild and free, you can see this sort of romanticization that's going on there. And I think it's really important to notice that and be like, that's interesting. Why is it that on the one hand we think of wildness as crazy, and on the other hand we like revere it as this like form of freedom? Um, and so if you look at the etymology of those things, wild comes from willed. So a willed creature is something that has its will about it, and it can do what it wants. It has its autonomy. It's not necessarily like doing what it wants in terms of like privilege or in terms of like entitlement. It's wildness that is not in the control of society that is like a slave essentially to whatever higher class system is in place. So you can have wildness and autonomy that is collaborative in the sense of mutual aid, or you can have wildness that can be competitive as well. Um, but if you look at all of those forms of wildness, the will is there in all of those things. And the converse of that is domestication, which is to break the will of another thing in order to have it serve your purposes, right? So the root of the word domestication is dom, which comes from the word home or house. A dom was like a domicile or dome, and it's literally to make something of the house. So in the Neolithic times, from the transition of some hunter-gatherer societies that ended up farming, we call that the Neolithic Revolution. New stone is what Neolithic means, and that's because we see an interesting transition there between um, more portable and mobile stone tools to more sedentary, heavy hand axes, grinding stones, and things like that that are more aligned for an agricultural type subsistence. So there was this transition in places all over the world, but not everybody in the world picked up farming. It was in these small little pockets where people started experimenting with it in different ways. Um, and it's likely that humans have been, cultivating their landscapes for a long time intentionally. But we have a hard time kind of noticing some of that things, partly because of our cultural lens as only seeing like specific types of farming as cultivation, and partly because intentional cultivation could look invisible. It could just look like a biodiverse forest, and nobody really understands how and why humans were consciously manipulating the land to make more biodiversity as opposed to less. So if you look at domestication, it's that bringing animals into the home, the dom, and literally in the Neolithic, that's where animals would come in those Stone Age roundhouses. You would bring your animals like goats and chickens and whatever other things. You would bring them into the domicile at night, and so animals actually lived in the house with people for quite a while. Um, and if you look at the neighboring words or the cousin of domestication, it's dominance, right? So to bring something of the house is to dominate it, is to um, bring it under your control, so to speak. If you look at the word husbandry, like animal husbandry, it's the same thing. Husband, housebound. So we're looking at this idea of holding something captive in our midst, right? And so there's this kind of split of free and captive. And when we think about like what is tame, we think of something that's will has been broken. It is now tame. It is docile. It will not try to escape. Um, and so that split there of the willed, your own personal will and the will of all the things, right? Like wind has a will, the clouds have a will, gravity has a will, like those forces of nature of their own power. And when you try to control those, you have things like, um, over time, through domestication, we can see genetic markers on particular things that have been in captivity or been in human control for so long that they've lost their ability to connect their will to the congress of wills of an ecosystem. And so you have um, got to pause for a second. um, After time, domestication will alter DNA, and that's when we actually call something domesticated, because we can see either through archaeology or genetics that has been in captivity for so long that we've actually altered their DNA. So an example might be um, the swelling of fruit, right? Like we've been eating fruit for so long that we've been selective harvesting it. When I say we, I'm talking specifically about agriculturalist civilization. Obviously, the Bushmen are not doing this, right? The hunter gatherers that exist today didn't choose to start farming. So they're not necessarily like living fossils of prehistory. They are another choice that humanity made and continued to make for the last 10,000 years to not farm, to not manipulate the land in the way that we perceive it, as being necessitating our existence or something like that. And most, civilizations and farming cultures perceive their way of life as the God given, God commanded practice to exist. We farm. That's what humans do. That's what the belief system says for us. Um, so one of the genetic things you can see, like with plants in particular, is that they now know that certain plants, when they start to be consumed by animals, will um, ex- they'll start putting out a hormone that warns the other plants that they're being consumed and that they should start producing more toxin, bitter chemicals. And so those plants will start producing those things, so that when they start to get nibbled on by the creature, um, they'll the creature won't want to eat it because it'll be too bitter, right? So plants are constantly communicating with each other and warning each other of things like that. And what they found is that domesticated plants don't really do that anymore. They've lost the ability, through so much cultivation, through so much alienation from the rest of the natural world, that they no longer have that communicative ability. And that is a huge problem. That is a lack of resilience, because what it means is that it's so dependent on the captor that it can't exist in the wild, in the wild. It can't be a part of that will anymore. And if we look at that, we can kind of see all of these different ways that plants and animals have been domesticated over the years. And I try not to get too much into that, because to me, originally when I came across the word rewilding, there wasn't a firm definition online um, that I could find. I found about three or four definitions that were sort of run on paragraphs about what it meant. And so when I formed the website rewild.com, I went through and I kind of, what I say, synthesized a definition for the website, to be on the splash page, which was rewild, to return to a more natural or wild state, the process of undoing domestication. And that definition is basically everywhere now. A lot of people picked it up and went with it, so much so that nobody really knows the origin. Nobody knows that I synthesized that definition. I don't consider myself, the founder of a rewilding movement or anything like that. I didn't come up with the word. I found it. It was already in use. And what I did was contribute to the movement by synthesizing a clear definition and promoting that through various online platforms in the early to mid aughts. Um, and so I tend to avoid nowadays that sub aspect of it, of rewilding as undoing domestication. I don't believe that anymore, because undoing domestication is still an attempt at controlling a will or a preconceived notion of what wildness is. But wildness isn't a thing. It's a constantly changing thing based on all of the other wills. When you're actually in congress with your environment, it is changing you. You are not changing it. So in order to rewild, we don't need to undo domestication. We need to embrace wildness and allow ourselves to be changed by the ecosystems that we are a part of. A great example of of a group of people who failed this concept and didn't understand it, and it's Godwin's laws. Eventually, you bring up the Nazis. The Nazis, they, through genetic engineering and selective breeding, not genetic engineering, but through selective breeding, they wanted to reproduce the auroch, which is the ancestral wild animal of a cow. So a cow the domesticated cow came from a wild animal named the auroch, which is no longer in existence. Um, we could rewild cows; they would not be aurochs ever again, but they could be wild again through a relationship to will, right? To the wills of an ecosystem. But the way that the Nazis went about it was thinking a preconceived notion of wildness as aggressive and dominating, because we have this perspective of wildness that comes from our society, which perceives nature as inherently violent and competitive. And so that was their that was their end point, was to get this cow. That's their perception of what an auroch was. A wild auroch clearly had to be aggressive. So what they did was they selectively bred this species of cow to look like an auroch, and be really mean. So you have this really mean cow that looks like an auroch, but that's not a wild auroch. That's a domesticated animal that's been bred to look and act a certain way. It is not an animal that has been rewilded through the congress of wills in an ecosystem. Its genetics have been modified and guided specifically for a preconceived notion of what wildness is or was. That's not how we rewild. That's not how we make it back. We don't try to selectively, uh, you know, choose what wildness is per se. What we want to do is choose to be in the Congress of Wills, to understand what it means to collaborate and work with the ecosystem that we are a part of. So I'm no longer really think about rewilding as undoing domestication per se, because undoing domestication is that process of thinking you know what that means instead of embracing wildness. So when I think about rewilding, to me, it's the process of embracing wildness because we don't know what wildness necessarily looks like because it is constantly changing and our preconceived notions of it might look totally different than what we think. I like to use the word cottywomple, which I don't is not in use in the United States really, but I think is a term in the UK to mean to wander toward a yet to wander with intent toward a yet unknown destination. And so our intent is to rewild, but we don't know what wildness is. So we have that intention set out to do that, and we're wandering in that direction, even though we don't know what the end goal will be. That to me is rewilding. And so I want to talk a little bit about what humans did in that type of wild relationship. And that starts with going all the way back to the origins of humanity. So, in my Rewilding 101 class, one of my favorite things to ask people is like, how old are humans? It's kind of a trick question because our genus that people start calling us humans is actually 3 million years old, which people are very surprised to find out. Um, this is it's interesting that we have how many years of schooling and most people don't even know much about how humans got here or human evolution or any of those things. um, and they're all surprised to kind of realize, oh yeah, I guess I don't really know anything about humanity. I know about how to do some subtraction and addition and these different things that will kind of function in the society, but I don't really have the narrative of where humans came from. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. But if we go all the way back to 3 million years, Homo sapiens, our physical uh, contemporary species is Homo sapiens, and we are about 200. It depends on what evidence you're following. There is evidence that points to 300,000 to 400,000 years old, but the standard belief or the standard amount is like 150 to 250,000 years is how long Homo sapiens have been in existence, and we haven't really changed all that much. Um, but if we want to go back all the way to the beginning of our genus, that starts at 3 million years ago, or 2.5 million if you're going to be very specific to obvious evidence. So that species was called Homo habilis, and that means handyman. So you have the first stone tool use. Well, of course, this was the first stone tool use until a decade ago when they found stone tool use on the surface of Africa that dated to 3.3 million years ago. So the difference that they used to delineate between Australopithecus, which is the ancestor before the Homo genus, and Homo habilis is this stone tool use. But then they just found this evidence that puts stone tool use back to 3.3 million years. So does that mean we have to extend when humans started, or are we going to acknowledge that other animals that came before us were using this technology too, the way that sometimes chimpanzees use stone tools or spears or things like that, or other primates use tools as well? So there's a lot of weird gray area in evolution. Um, Homo erectus came about around 1.5 million years ago, and these are when we talk about these dates, we're talking about these like cherry picked moments in time. It's like a snapshot of our evolution. So at 1.5 million years ago, we have evidence that humans were walking upright through their skeletal structure remains that we found. So we changed the name from Homo habilis, the handyman, to Homo erectus, which means the upright man, the upright person. Um, and that's when we started walking, right? So it's not that we started walking exactly 1.5 million years ago. It's that we know we were walking 1.5 million years ago because of the evidence. But the gaps in between the skeletons that we found, is this gradient of transformation over time. Um, Now, the next sort of leap is, there's the other interesting thing about all of this is that, there's over 15 species of humans that have been found in Africa. And again, every time they find a new skeleton, it's a little bit differently shaped than the last one, or bits of a skeleton. And so they give it a new species name, unless it matches perfectly to a previous one, which is super problematic. And they finally realized this like 5 years ago or 10 years ago or something along those lines, where they were excavating a site and found 5 human skulls buried in the same context, but they all had different morphology, so different shapes. Now, if they had found all of those skulls in different locations, they would have all given them a different species name. But in archaeology, when you find something all in the same context buried together like that, it means something different, and you have to give them all the same species name. So they kind of had this aha moment where they were like, has anybody ever checked the like variable of human morphology in contemporary times? And so they did an analysis and found that it matched the archaeological record, where now they think that all of the different species essentially were the same species, but with micro variations from all kinds of different things. Your diet can change the way your skeletal structure develops. Um, and then natural selection in particular environments can alter the size of the animal, etc. Like they found like the pygmies and things like that, smaller people, a smaller stature, but are still technically Homo sapiens. Um, so you have this really interesting sort of thing happening right now, in that, and also the ability to sequence DNA. They say that Neanderthals were, an older myth was that Neanderthals were wiped out by Homo sapiens. Well, now they're realizing through DNA sequencing that they interbred. And so, what that means in the standard definition of biology, there's lots of different definitions of what a species is, but in the standard, most commonly accepted one, a species is defined as, being able to have a viable offspring with another animal that can go on and have another viable offspring. The fact that I have, 3.5% of my DNA is Neanderthal means that Neanderthal is the same species as Homo sapiens in that, from that framework, right? And so they didn't go extinct. They hybridized with Homo sapiens. So everybody who has DNA that of people who migrated out of Africa 60 to 90,000 years ago has either both Neanderthal DNA or Denisovans, which is like East Asia humans. All of us are branches of Homo erectus. And so in theory, we're all still Homo erectus, just in a varied fashion, right? This is sort of a sidetrack, but I feel like it's important to kind of cover this vast and interesting connection that we have to all of these different species that we have labeled as different species, but potentially could all really just be the same species of humanity, just trying out different techniques. One comparison I'll make to um, Homo sapiens and Neanderthal is that they're different animals, but we're the same species. So if you look at like um, eastern coyote and gray wolves, they diverged 200,000 years ago, but they just did DNA tests on eastern coyote and found out that it's actually like 30% wolf DNA and like 5% domestic dog, which means again there's this hybridization mechanism in evolution that um, is about adaptation. All of evolution is really just about adaptation, right? And so, for whatever reason, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals hybridized to adapt to probably changing environments. And so, one of the reasons why I like to bring that up is just because it dispels the myth of Homo sapiens violently murdering all of the Neanderthals, right? In prehistory, we don't really know all of the things, all of the details. That could have happened too, right? But the idea that humans are inherently violent kind of starts with that concept, and then from there moves on to this idea of Homo sapiens killing all the megafauna, causing the megafauna extinctions across the world as they migrated to various places. But correlation is not causation. So there's a lot of factors we don't know. And in particular, one of the things I think about with climate change is I have like triggers for Google News to tell me things. So climate change and megafauna extinctions are like, some of my phrases to catch articles. So every week I'll get a news article that says, climate change is the real culprit behind the megafauna extinctions. Now we know, it's proven. And then a week later I get another email headline is like, data set from computer proves it was humans that made the megafauna go extinct. The nail in the coffin. Now we know this as a fact. And then the next week I get one that's like, humans, you're off the hook. It was climate change that here's this different evidence and blah blah blah. And it's just this running cycle of blaming people or blaming climate change. I think there's two problems with that. One is that they're really trying to blame people is this weird disconnect between humans and our wildness, and it's not recognizing that climate change and humans are part of the same systems. um, and you can't remove or blame one particular species for something that's happening in a whole system. So it was definitely impacted by humans and climate change. You can't like try to pick one or the other. Like humans killed them all or climate change killed them all. We're part of one huge global system. And so it's not about blaming any particular aspect of that. It's about understanding what changed in the system that caused the whole system to change. Um, and we don't know. Climate change was probably a huge part of it. And the fact that megafauna were going extinct could also mean that uh, humans were migrating into areas that they didn't have access to before because the megafauna were there. So who knows what happened? And I'm very willing to uh, look into the idea that it was in a large part based on human activity. Um, but before judging that or blaming humans in an innately violent nature, we have to look at the whole system that was created and what humans were responding to, that might have caused those things, right? So, we go forward and we look at the Neolithic Revolution. So, right before the Neolithic Revolution, you have the Upper Paleolithic. And the Upper Paleolithic is, you know, uh, essentially 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, or around that 70,000. We see in the archaeological record intensification of tool production in various ways, diversification and intensification of tool production, which could have been a response to loss of megafauna. Who knows? Um, but we see that happening. You see, the refinement, quote unquote, of technology. If you were to look at this through the lens of mythological progress, you might see mythological progress. If you were to look at this through the lens of evolution, what you see is technological adaptation to changing environments, not necessarily humans progressing and becoming more and more complex, but rather humans adapting in all over the world to different environments that they've been migrated, that they've newly been introduced to in some cases, like Australia. Um, but you see this refinement and unique technologies being sort of made up all over the world in various capacities to adapt to the changing environments where people existed, and have existed. So, with the introduction of the Neolithic, well, before I get into that, I'm gonna just duck down here. I have this thing that I do with my Rewilding 101 students. It's called Myths of Prehistory Bingo. And this is a collection of all of the strange things that we talk about when we talk about our human ancestors, and oftentimes they're regarded as stupid, or when you think of the caveman motif, caveman, what's the word I'm looking for? Motif. The caveman, the idea that humans were stupid and wore rags and that kind of thing. Um, so here's this whole list, and I have people take this from me and then they start looking through it, trying to find these things as they go throughout their week between classes. And when we come back to class, we'll look at this and be like, oh, what did you see in pop culture that that reinforce this mythology about hunter gatherers or cave people? And the interesting thing too about a lot of these things is that they were translated directly over to racism, particularly things about low intelligence and violence and hypersexuality and things like that. We um, There was this projection of this like animalism and these things that were below like humanity, right? And that when we started civilization, we stepped away from this like animal thing, and we're at a higher thing. So people who still have this like our caveman ancestors and these other races, right? So there was this projection of all of this kind of mythology onto um, various people. And so, like here, a couple of the things is poor hygiene, you know. But think about wild animals. Do they have poor hygiene? No. So any animal with poor hygiene is a sick animal. It's not like humans were walking around sick all the time. Uh, so obviously, if you were a hunter gatherer or a cave person, whatever, however you want to look at that, even that word cave is ridiculous because humans have been living in all kinds of shelters for a really long time, right? So where did this idea come from? It's trying to help the mythology of that we've projected onto our past is a way of thinking that we have a better life now, um, without actually looking into it. And archaeology has proven that we don't. The lifespan, there's this. It's my biggest pet peeve. Is when people think that hunter gatherers only lived to 30 or 35 years in prehistory. That's just not true. Again, like I said, Homo sapiens have been in the same physiological form, more or less, for 150 to 250,000 years. And they finally did lifespan studies. There's a really great, long, thick anthropological thing that came out in 2007 about hunter-gatherer lifespan. And what they found was that there's a little bit of a higher infant mortality rate, but if you make it past the age of 2, you're probably going to make it to the age of like 75 or beyond. Um, and so immediate return hunter-gatherers around the world have a lifespan that is actually longer than most industrializing countries, or on par with industrial countries, right? And the industrial countries of today only got to back to that lifespan in the last like 100 years with oil production. But if you look at agriculturalists' lifespan, you see that it got really short really fast. Um, and this is true across the board for all kinds of aspects of agricultural systems. When we look at the archaeological record of the Neolithic, you see bone density decreasing. You see tooth decay. You see like heart disease and diabetes. There's loads of diseases that came with the Neolithic Revolution, um, in large part because humans stopped eating such diverse diets, and moved on to calorie rich diets which lack nutrients. And so we're talking about agricultural products, right? Like grains, essentially. Grains are very high in calories, but they do not have a lot of nutrition. And so when you look at these societies that switched over to grain versus their neighboring hunter-gatherer societies that maintained a diverse diet, of plants and animals, you see their bone structure remaining the same. You see their teeth are coming in the straight and perfect, what we would call perfect like teeth. They don't need braces, etc. Versus the neighboring societies who aren't getting the nutrition for generations, and so their teeth come in crooked and that kind of thing. Their jaws aren't the right shape for the teeth. There's all kinds of evidence. Some people here are probably familiar with Weston Price. He was a dentist who went around the world in the early 1900s photographing people's teeth. And one of the things that he noticed was these hunter gatherers and pastoralists had just like perfect teeth, and their neighboring agriculturalists had crooked teeth. And so, you can see this very visceral evidence of something, and he called it factor X. He couldn't figure out what it was. Now they know it's potassium K. It's vitamin K. It's a mineral that you get in a lot of animal products. So that's what he was essentially um, claiming later on, was that it's this particular vitamin K comes in, you get it in bone broth, etc., things like that, in large quantities. So, looking at that, there's this interesting take on agriculture being not only bad for our bodies but bad for the environment because wow, it's already 40 minutes in. And I'm still talking about the myths of prehistory and the Neolithic. So, transitioning to the next phase, which is kind of understanding ecology, what we need to do is understand why this form of life is inherently destructive. There's a lot of reasons, but I won't be able to cover all of them in an hour. Um, the main ones I like to talk about is understanding how forest succession works. So, in forest succession, succession is the process of barren ground turning into a biodiverse forest filled with life. So, the process of an island or something like that, a volcano comes up from the ocean. There's nothing on it. Eventually, wind blows dust. Dust gets stuck in there. Lichens and other plants start growing on it. They start catching more soil. Eventually, you have rooting plants that seeds land there and they start to dig their roots down and crack open the volcanic rock, and soil collects, and they're dying and regrowing, and soil builds, and eventually you get trees and shrubs, and eventually you have a whole ecosystem, right? That's called succession. If you look at the primary succession, those are primary plants. Prime means first. So the first plants that colonize are generally called annuals. Annual meaning they live for 1 year. So they grow, produce seed, drop their seeds, and die. They don't have a taproot. They're not perennial, which means to come back year after year, or biennial, which means they have a 2 year life cycle. Annuals have a 1 year life cycle. When you have a agricultural system, it only works with agra literally means field. So field culture. Culture comes from the root, the Roman word colere, which means to till the soil. So now when we think about cultivate used to mean to till the soil. Now it means, manipulation of the land, conscious manipulation of the land by humans. It doesn't necessarily mean till the soil. But if you think about that in the origin of the word culture being literally to till the soil, you can kind of understand the anthropocentrism in societies who tilled the soil, who didn't perceive anyone else as cultured because they weren't tilling the soil, which is literally what culture means or meant at that point in time. So if you think about it now, the word cultivate, uh, it means to consciously manipulate the land, right? So in terms of agriculture, agra means field, culture, to consciously manipulate the land for a particular thing. Um, you have this idea where agriculture is constant field. So in order to grow a field, you have to have weeds because you don't have to have weeds. Weeds are part of succession, right? Weeds are doing a very important job. They're diversifying. They're fixing the soil. They're breaking up the soil. They're creating soil with their dead bodies. So there's this process of succession. But when you have a field culture where all you can have is a field, then you end up with just a field. And so this is why civilization is kind of marked with deforestation, because in order to get a grass field, you have to deforest an entire region and then plant an annual grain. So it's a it's a process of constant deforestation. There's no such thing as a weed until you have agriculture, because a weed is serving a very important purpose. In fact, a lot of them are medicinal or nutritious in their own right. But if you're trying to grow a monoculture of a particular species and maintain it as a field culture, you all of a sudden start a war with nature. Whereas indigenous land management practices, like even Swidden agriculture or shifting agriculture, is a way of embracing succession by causing a disturbance through usually fire, um, that that restarts the phases of succession in particular areas. So you have a mosaic of ecosystems. And when you reduce a particular area down to a field, it's going to come back up into a forest again. So oftentimes with indigenous practices, they would burn areas, or still do today, and plant them with particular foods they wanted that were part of primary succession, consume those, and then as they became shrubs and trees and other things, be using those products while burning and having other areas be open to those things too. And so that particular cultivation technique is called horticulture. Horta means garden, culture to consciously manipulate an environment. So if you think about the differences there, one is horticulture is about creating a diversity, like a garden is diverse, whereas agra is a field. I'm oversimplifying things a bit here, right? So um, I don't think of agriculture as like a dirty word or as a problem per se. It's when the majority of your food product comes from agriculture, or there's a tipping point where, generally speaking, in anthropology, if a group of people are getting 50% or more of their food from agriculture, they're labeled as an agriculturalist society. So think about that. Agriculture in and of itself, field culture, is fine if you're just growing things in a mosaic of succession. So it's not just a field. You have a garden, right? So that a garden, the field part is just one part of that. So agriculture, if it's one part of your subsistence, is fine. But when it becomes 50% or more, then you have to just constantly be deforesting regions. And there's a lot more other things that go into that that I don't have time to talk about. So I'm not going to end up going too much into that. But what I want to talk about next is what's called immediate return versus delayed return societies. Um, so immediate return, James Woodburn, an anthropologist in the 70s, he's still an anthropologist, or he coined the term in the 70s, immediate return versus delayed return. And this has to do with food storage. So immediate return hunter-gatherers are hunter-gatherers who live in environments where food storage is not necessary. Um, and it is hypothesized that this is how humans evolved, eating the things that come off immediately, right? So there's an immediate return from the things that we are gathering. If you think about delayed return, means you have to go out, gather a bunch of things, and then you're storing it for a later time, oftentimes very much later, months, right? Um, and that changes the consciousness. It changes our perception of time. We have to be following things a little bit more. We have to be thinking about spoilage all of a sudden. If all of our eggs are in this basket of storage, it means that we have to be more sedentary because our food is now in this one place that we're storing it. It means we have to be more aggressive to defend that food, because if food is everywhere in the environment, you don't have to defend it. There's no way to defend it. It's just everywhere, right? People can go out and get it wherever they want. But what's challenging is once you have food storage, you actually have to guard your food storage. So one of the theories around that upper Paleolithic is that food storage became more and more prevalent. Um, there's a lot of theories behind actually the bow and arrow being not a tool for hunting, but a tool of warfare, and that it was invented specifically to deal with interhuman, interspecies conflicts in the upper Paleolithic. Um, and that's when, potentially delayed return societies have become more of a thing. Um, and food storage is kind of a vague term. There's a lot more nuance to what I'm talking about. It's different than caching, for example, which is a form of food storage. Um, it has to do with how much you're defending that one particular place, or how much you have invested in being sedentary and defending a food source instead of diversifying your food source and getting it from all over. Agriculture is not possible without food storage. Um, and even in the archaeological record, all of these things lead to, and contemporary societies today, we see an increase in interspecies violence in sedentary societies, in delayed return societies. Um, and that's just like, one of the things about, I think, the Pandora's box that humans opened at some point, some humans opened, and is now a legacy for a lot of our societies, is this agricultural civilization. And I want to define civilization because a lot of people falsely define it as if it's a synonym for the term civil society. Um, Civilization, if you look up the dictionary definition, has a few things that are very specific. First of all, you have to have a writing system. So if a culture doesn't have a writing system, it's not considered a civilization by definition. Second, what they call advanced or complex political structure, which is basically a way of whitewashing slavery, so and hierarchy. So a civilization is basically an agricultural society that has been agriculture for long enough that they invent writing to basically all writing and math comes from cataloging grain storages. Because when you have a sedentary system, you have to have a way of keeping track of the grain in a granary. So most writing and mathematics stems from that. Of course, humans are beautiful, creative, amazing animals, so we're going to come up with beautiful ways of doing that. So I think of like hieroglyphs and things like that as just like gorgeous representations. Eventually, we make it more and more alienating and more iconic or whatever as time went on, and the technology transformed. But civilization is essentially that. It's a combination of agriculture, food storage, slavery, and you have this society that is politically locked into a particular way of life that centralizes resources, stratifies wealth socially, and then it gets perpetually stuck in that phase until something else happens that allows that coalescence of things to diffuse and turn into something else, or the people of that society adapt by abandoning the particulars of civilization and either returning to more resilient life ways or creating more resilient life ways. The concept of collapse is definitely one that is projected by civilizations, people in power, to mythologize the process of people abandoning civilization for something better. Because people of civilization have a really hard time imagining that life could have been better before or could be better after. And that's because the power structure here wants us to continue to be domesticated. They don't want people to realize that life is better as a willed, autonomous uh, subsistence strategy and social strategy and all those things, because that would destroy their power structure that they have in place. Um, and so, you know, how do we rewild, right? To me, rewilding is about this abandonment for something better. It's about recognizing that, right now we're experiencing this pandemic. Pandemics are one of the things that catalyze, quote, or so-called collapse. They catalyze the adaptation of people finding a new and better way to live in the changing circumstances in which they find themselves, or the contexts in which they find themselves. And oftentimes civilizations collapse. The people don't collapse necessarily. Pandemics, warfare, those are the things that can reduce populations rapidly, but the populations don't go away. Civilizations might disappear. They say disappear. What happened is the people didn't disappear. The political structure collapsed. The people adapted to a better way of life. And that's scary for the political systems that exist today who want to maintain their power. So, to me, rewilding is really about adapting in these times to recognize that the political systems that exist here are essentially forcing us through domestication to participate in a way of life that is inherently destructive. And our job when rewilding is to look back into prehistory and at contemporary people today who still exist in a relative balance, whatever that means. I have a lot of problems with that word too, but they live in a constant form of adaptability with their environments, so that they never have huge crashes, right? There's no huge ecosystem crash if you're constantly in flux in those ways. And so those ways still exist, and we know what they are. Indigenous people are willing to teach often and want to teach because they recognize the severity of the situation. And so to me, rewilding is about embracing traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people and adapting to this changing way of life that we have so that we can reclaim our wills as autonomous beings, but also reclaim our connection to the world and our connection to the rest of the ecosystem, because that's one of the ways that domestication has messed with us psychologically, is the alienation from the natural world. And that's sad because as humans we've been shaped by the natural world and we help shape the natural world. It's a conversation. And through domestication, through the fence, through that alienation, we've lost the ability to communicate in a way, just like those plants I mentioned earlier in the conversation here about plants that lost their ability to warn the other plants about consumption. We're a lot like that. Maybe not physiologically, I don't like to get in that, but culturally, we've lost a connection. And so, and when I say we, again, I'm talking about people of civilization, not indigenous people that live today. Before I go, one of the last things I want to say is thinking along these lines, you have to recognize that um, you know the human species isn't inherently evil. If you look at prehistory, we lived here for 3 million years. There's still humans today that live in equilibrium with and adapt to their environments. It's not humans inherently flawed. It's a society, right? And I actually don't really think anyone in particular is to blame. We could blame those in power, and that's definitely one avenue to go in. But if you look at the whole system of how civilization works, those people are created by the mythology to do the things that they do, right? To maintain the power structures. And so, in a sense, it's nobody's particular fault that this happened. It's just a thing, a coalescence of forces that created it. And those forces are all going to change and go away. And so, it's our job to elevate the voices and life ways of people who have been continuously living sustainably for millions of years and adapting and figuring out how to do this cultivation thing without reducing biodiversity. Um, okay. So I'd like to open it up for some Q&A, but I'm not sure if I can see people's questions really in this window. So if you have any Q&A, you can throw some at me. I've got I'm going to do a real quick pitch here. If you want to read my book, it's called Rewild or Die. It covers a lot of this stuff. It's written in the muse or alter ego of my character, Urban Scout. You can see it doesn't say Peter Michael Bauer on there. That's a really long story. It's kind of talked about in the beginning of the book. It's not particularly my voice. It was a particular muse that I wrote the book through. And so, I thought of myself at the time more as like the George Carlin of Rewilding. So I think there's an F word on every other page or something along those lines. It's about 10 years old now or more, 12, 14, keeps getting older. Um, I'm going to be running one of my Rewilding 101 classes. It's an online class, and I've scheduled it so that it will be at 6 p.m. in the UK, and that'll be in June. So if you go to rewildportland.com under the adult education side, you'll see the Rewilding 101 class, or if you just Google Rewilding 101, I think it's probably the first or up in the first hits. If you're interested in kind of taking this topic and exploring it more deeply with me and with a group of people around the world, that's a really great opportunity to do so. So I highly recommend checking that out if you can. And yeah, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. I'm really excited to have been a part of this, and I hope y'all got something out of it and not wasted an hour of your time. I'm going to answer some questions probably in the Q&A because I think maybe I messed up and didn't make it available for people to ask questions. And if you have any questions, I will be doing a Q&A mid-May or another Facebook Live like this, like a Q&A, through the Extinction Rebellion Rewilding Facebook group. So if you'd like to throw some questions at me there, I think James and I will probably be announcing it in that group pretty soon here in a week or so. We'll figure out a time and post that in there. So yeah, thank you so much. And I look forward to connecting with some of the folks from this session in person and at some point. Thank you. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.